So the flurry has begun. It has been a very busy week for the new president of the United States, and that's not unprecedented. Usually in the American system of government and the American popular consumption of that system, a new president is given what's called the first 100 days. There's kind of a honeymoon period. Now, since this is a second term, even though it feels like a first term, the fact of the matter is for Donald Trump, it'll probably only be 50 days. Everything will be cut in half. And that's because that's also the normal way, because we know Donald Trump and he's made it pretty clear where he's going. So there's clearly a point in time where right now the administration is kind of driving the train. It won't be long before suddenly that changes. So the big question is what's happening while it appears that the executive branch has got their hands on the controls, and that's executive orders.
Yeah, they've needed a lot of pens in the first week or so of his administration, right? Because every time
I think they're markers.
Yeah, I know everyone keeps calling them pens, but yeah,
they're
like
markers.
He does have a cool signature, I gotta say. It's a very cool looking signature.
Totally unique.
Yeah,
Very unique. You would have to think Donald Trump would be the guy that practiced it through the years as well. Like he sat in the room and made sure that he was going to perfect that. But yeah, they need a lot of markers because there's a new one for everyone that he signs, whether he's signing a bill into law or he's signing an executive order. There's going to be the marker that goes along with that.
Yeah, and who they give it to.
And who they give it to.
Which is
and usually there's a stack there because there's going to be more than one person that gets one, depending if it's an executive order or a piece of legislation.
Well, there's different kinds of executive orders. And I understand that the pen or the marker that signed the executive order for the release of all of the secret files in regards to the RFK, JFK, and Martin Luther King Jr. assassinations, that marker was delivered to RFK Jr.
That was a really nice moment. Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
That was cool.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. And an executive order where the chief executive officer, from a constitutional perspective, is basically saying, I'm ordering that we uncover these files. That's pretty much within the purview of what the Constitution affords the chief executive and the commander-in-chief to do. So that's one of people say, well, about time somebody got in there and did something about that. Well, it usually takes the momentum from the top. And now there's some other ones that we've observed that seem to be both in good order and in good time.
Yeah, the pardoning of the pro-lifers was very huge. I think it was, 23 people. Some of them were in jail. Others were maybe not incarcerated at the time, but they had charges and were facing legal challenges. And so he pardoned these peaceful pro-life protesters, and that was a great moment.
We've talked about over the past 4 years the federal law and how it was used to go after some of these pro-lifers who were standing on sidewalks or who were quietly praying or who were basically harassed by others. And then you saw people's homes get raided. You saw people's lives ruined in this way. So yeah, that was one that people can rally around.
The question I was going to ask is, well, why would it come to that? I mean, what broke down? That innocent people were actually, or were they innocent? I mean, is the whole thing based on a law?
Well, they were running into the FACE Act, the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, and so that's what they were running up against. But it's, I mean, so is, by the way,
you get serious points there for doing that from memory. Okay, that was very impressive. I knew what the FACE Act was, and I knew that was the law, but I didn't know what it actually. I just spell it out.
No,
very good.
I've got a computer. Don't worry.
Okay.
Well, and it was being applied in a way where it wasn't the intent of the law, but I feel like the federal government, a very pro-abortion administration, was trying to make an example of pro-life individuals that were just trying to stay out of the way and just trying to offer sincere help. And they weren't blocking entrances in ways that you would think when you hear that.
Right. This was signed by Bill Clinton, and it was just specifically targeted, to your point, Rob, it was specifically targeted to a group of people that would be peacefully praying and praying. It was a law that was like written to include them in the circle of breaking it, And so it was nice to see.
No, I've always thought it was a bad law. It's a bad law, and then you have a Justice Department that goes out of control to select political enemies and to harass and prosecute them for lots of reasons. And so the president comes in with an executive order and releases those people from the tyranny of the progressive left, utilizing a bad law passed by the tyrannical majorities of the progressive left and then enforced by the tyrannical elites of the Justice Department. So the president comes in and says, A, you're pardoned, and B, you're not doing this anymore. The Justice Department does answer to the administrative branch of the executive branch, and that's done. All right, my attorney general will not permit that to go forward. Problem is, we still got a bad law in the books.
Got a bad law. And that's what a lot of times it boils down to, right? Is the bad law in the books, and how do we get rid of the bad law? Because that should be the next step in the process, because the executive order doesn't have the ability to ease or erase that. If someone from the far left pro-abortion administration is back in office in 4 years, they could send the Justice Department back to enforce this same law.
So other examples, let's go historically, examples of executive orders in the past.
Oh, there's a handful that we were looking for.
Yeah,
obviously, the one that's talked about is, and it was during a time of war, the Emancipation Proclamation started as an executive order when it was initially written by Abraham Lincoln. Then that was at a time of war, so it has a bit different context than others that would be issued by presidents. I mean, when you look throughout history and you look at, Washington used executive orders. Now, obviously, George Washington used them in ways that are different than what they're used today. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and I yield to the Washington expert on the panel on this one, but his first one had to do with asking the people that were the head of, in essence, departments, what is happening there? Give us a rundown of what's going on and what will be happening.
Well, you caught me on that one. I'm unfamiliar with that, so I have to kick that up to Dr. Allen for the instant reference note on that one.
Well, I do think that also signs the neutrality to keep us out of war with France, I believe, as well, was one of his orders.
Yeah. Now, this is an interesting point, because we're talking about the Neutrality Act or the Emancipation Proclamation. These kinds of questions, when the executive officer, the president, is acting in the constitutional role of commander in chief, there's a lot more constitutional lane there. Yeah. There's more space. So when the president's acting in a time of war in regards to directly a foreign treaty or foreign nation, foreign policy, now where it gets strange is when it gets into domestic policy. And the president is, in essence, on either side, whether you would interpret this as right or left or whatever, where the president is attempting to influence the outcome of the application of a law or to stop the implementation of a law. Now things get a little bit unusual, or in regards like to the Constitution. So let's go to the executive order on birthright citizenship. There's about an hour-long conversation, right?
I think that could be a college-level class. You talk about Article 2 of the Constitution. I would love to know the Google analytics of when Article 2 is Googled the most. And I would guess it's at the beginning of every presidential term when they start rolling out some of these executive orders. People are like Googling it. But yes, birthright citizenship is one that is going to be discussed and dissected throughout.
Why don't we just read?
And that takes us right back to the 14th Amendment.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's just read a little piece of the 14th Amendment. So we just set the baseline. Everybody knows what we're talking about. Section 1, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So that's where that opens. And so that's where the fight's going to be.
Yeah, and this is ratified in 1868. So these are post-war, post-Civil War amendments, 13th, 14th Amendment, and 15th, in regards to establishing the equal rights of people who were previously enslaved. And that's the nature of this. And it's very simple when you put it into that perspective. Two people who were previously enslaved have a child. Let's not make any questions. It doesn't matter where their parents came from or how long they've been here. That child is a full equal citizen of the United States. That was not the way it was in the old slave system. And so it's a very clear marker. Makes a lot of sense. Now, in the modern era, and this just wasn't the modern era, people that came over from an immigrant perspective in the 1900s that were in the process of citizenship for this number of years, if they had children before the parents were technically the 7-year wait to become citizens, those children under this provision were immediately citizens. But it wasn't that big a deal then.
Because the parents were part of the legal process.
Right. They were in the process and they had come here legally.
Yes.
So this is really, this attempt to alter the Constitution is an attempt to solve a problem that we've got to put this in the right order. We got to think this through. There are people who are now coming here for the purpose of giving birth to a child so that the child would be, in essence, what we call an anchor baby, and that the child is a citizen of the United States. So this is complicated.
That raises the question then, and this is where, it becomes political and all the name calling happens, because they say, okay, someone that's here illegally has a baby for what, the term they use is anchor baby for the citizenship. But if you want to then get rid of the parents that are here illegally and the baby's a United States citizen because the baby was born here, they're saying, well, now you're trying to break up families. Why would you break up families? And people are like, wait a minute here. The parents made this choice to come here illegally. No one's trying to break up families. There's a legal part of the process. But I think this just highlights when you have a porous southern border and northern border, many would argue, you run into these instances and problems.
Well, so do you both expect this executive order to end up in the Supreme Court for a decision at some point? Because I don't think an executive order doesn't trump, pun intended, doesn't trump the, people always say pun, no pun intended. I want to claim the pun. We're just letting these puns go. But an executive order wouldn't trump the Constitution itself. So I would imagine they're going to have to fight this out at some point.
Well, the court could go a lot of directions with this. The court could dismiss it, basically saying that an executive order doesn't merit Supreme Court review. They could say the law is what the law is. Next question, please, and refuse to hear this. They could completely walk away from it. This is an interesting conversation. Now, the president may have chosen to do this to launch the conversation. That could be really smart in regards to political debating points and moving something down the line that's an issue that's got to be dealt with. Clearly, this is going to take, we've got a Constitution right here. We're reading it. And this clearly touches on this language. So is it one of those things where the court just simply comes back and says, whether we feel this is a good or a bad idea, it is the domain of the Congress, not of the White House. So there's really nothing and they could issue a restraining order stopping this procedure. So that could happen. That could happen. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the executive order was a waste of time, because it draws focus to the issue and puts the ball back in Congress's court. But isn't that kind of where we're going anyways?
It's kind of where the ball belongs. They're the lawmaking body. They're the ones that have the ability to do it. Now, some would say, well, this is a constitutional question, so it's going to take a little bit of a bigger pull or push, depending which direction you want to go as it pertains to birthright citizenship. But I think, Dave, you hit on a very key point in understanding the 14th Amendment and where it came from and why it was implemented. I don't think a lot of people have the history of it. They just know that it's common to say every person born here is a United States citizen. Okay, well, why was the 14th Amendment done? And understand that context. I think that changes the discussion as it pertains to modern day.
And I think the hook, if there is going to be an argument in the courts, is on the language. Subject to the jurisdiction thereof is going to be the question. And because the contention will be that the parents are living outside the law, so that they don't have the legal standing to apply to this. Now, that's also another interest. That's law school debate stuff. Could be interesting. I'm sure it's not the first time it's been brought up. And so we could have an important history lesson. But I feel that what we might be in danger of doing, and I don't enjoy being the person who sends out the warnings. That's often the role that we have to play at the public square. It's the role that we play as the American Policy Roundtable far too often. Is because we've gotten far enough away from our history that we don't study it anymore, that we end up having these conversations kind of as observers because we are so far removed that we let the political forces and the courts make all the decisions for us. Now, that's not a constitutional republic. That's an oligarchy.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter whether it's Barack Obama doing the executive orders or Donald Trump. If the game gets played between the White House and the courts, we've left the vortex of power out of this process, and we're starting to act like we've gone back to Great Britain. We have a Congress that has the only lawmaking authority in the constitutional realm. And when Congress is left out of the equation, we're all big losers. And that's the danger.
There was one executive order throughout history that I'm reading, and it went from executive order and it made its way to the Supreme Court where Congress wasn't involved. That kind of jumped at me. 1952, Harry Truman issued an executive order because the United Steelworkers of America went on strike, and he nationalized all American steel mills, transferring control to the Secretary of Commerce. So he just took over all the steel mills via executive order. And I'm like, what? Like, I guess maybe
what did the court say?
The Supreme Court said, you can't do that. You can't just take business and nationalize the steel mills as they're fighting to control their own mills. The court said you could, but I'm reading that and I'm like, wow. I mean, for Truman to sign an order saying that in essence was taking the business, right? And the court said no.
But now if that had happened in 1942 and the president had been Franklin Delano Roosevelt and we had been in the middle of the war after Pearl Harbor, I bet the court would say that's a commander-in-chief call.
It's because it's a time of war and it's a need for the country as a whole. But you're right.
A declared war.
Yes, and you're right, where the lanes change and are different during a time of war.
You know, I'm not a fan of things that are really complicated. I do enjoy the simple life. And it troubles me. I was reading something that John Quincy Adams wrote recently, and we've been doing a study on his speech to Newburyport, Boston, in honor of the 61st anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And he's got a sentence about 2/3 of the way into the speech where he says, "Our system of government is complicated." I wish that wasn't true, but it is.
But isn't there a bit of safety in the complication? It means
that's a good point.
It means that somebody can't just come in and bulldoze the whole system, and I think that was part of the design.
Yeah.
So
a dictatorship is not complex.
No, it's
a dictatorship is very simple.
Very simple.
It's not complex.
Nor is an oligarchy.
Right.
And an oligarchy is just a dictatorship with friends.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that's all we're talking about.
I wish I would have bought stock in the word oligarchy about 3 weeks ago, because that word has been used more on talk radio and cable news. And I know that,
Well, can I bring up the other thing that folks are talking about with oligarchy? Some folks are concerned about a potential future tech oligarchy because of another announcement that Donald Trump made recently. And that was to stand up and announce with Larry Ellison of Oracle and Sam Altman of OpenAI a $500 billion investment into AI infrastructure, essentially big, giant AI servers built in Texas. And I got to say, that's a little creepy to me. It's a little creepy. Now, I prefer that the servers be in Texas than in Shanghai, but it still concerns me a little bit. What did you guys make of that?
It's difficult when a president acts like a governor. And you would expect a governor to be standing next to these business leaders saying, we're excited to have this company coming to our state, and here's how we're working it out, and here's the arrangements, and here are the benefits to our citizens. And we believe this will have ramifications in a positive way for the nation and the world. That's one thing. But when the president of the United States is doing it, it's unseemly. And what I mean by that is it seems out of order. Because anytime the president appears to be looking to pick winners and losers, even if it's just by publicity, and it doesn't matter whether it's Donald Trump or Barack Obama, we should stop and say, wait a second, that power feels like preference. How come these guys and not somebody else? Now, again, I'm not suggesting anything has been done in wrong order. What I'm suggesting is that it doesn't seem right. It doesn't look right. And in fact, it could go wrong.
Yeah. Well, that's
Now,
when the
Our system of government is complicated by design,
right, yeah.
which means somebody's got to ask the questions, right?
Right. You have to. And that's what we talked about this before we turned the cameras and the mics on today. You know, we just want to try to look at the situation and ask questions about it and try to figure out what's true.
Well, I'm just thinking what grabbed my attention is the $500 billion price tag.
Yeah,
in the
even-
sense that that's not a small, even from governmental spending standpoints, and I know government's not spending all the money. Right. That's such a big number.
Well, Elon tweeted they don't have the money because him and Sam Altman from OpenAI days aren't really buddies right now.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons. I mean, Elon wanted
Clash of the Titans.
Yeah, Elon wanted it, which is honestly, I'm glad that there are multiple Titans to clash. So thankfully that's true.
Is this the event? What was it? The Avengers Civil War?
Oh, Civil War.
Yeah, this is like the Avengers.
It kind of is.
Civil War. But they are also talking from medicinal purposes. The
Well,
mRNA.
if you can call it that. Yeah, we're trotting out another mRNA vaccine now and trying to link it with AI to cure cancer. I mean,
conceptually, Alan, mRNA began exclusively in the field of cancer research.
yeah, okay.
This was the idea that this new methodology was going to be able to transport a direct medicine treatment into specific cancer cells without having to use universal chemotherapy. So they're kind of going back to the beginning.
Right.
But cancer seems to be the cover for a lot of things, right?
Right. It seems to be almost a utopian vision. I'm going to cure cancer. And we've seen after kind of a
So how would AI do that?
Well, I think there's some gene sequencing that they'd be doing. They'd be looking at. They'd be, it's large data set models. So it'd be,
and I think they're studying what the future aspect of it. If you're born with the gene sequence of this, does it turn into that? And I think they're just studying the human. It blows my mind the little bit I look at it. I'm like, wow, this is so far over my head. I'm thankful there's smart people that understand this.
Well, and there are people that have called for a moratorium on mRNA research right now. There are those that say, hey, we just came out of COVID. We haven't even counted the illnesses and the dead bodies that might have resulted from this last mRNA vaccine. We're still trying to get information about that. We don't know. And so do we really need to be tying this to AI and pushing a massive investment? And again, the person announcing this is Larry Ellison of Oracle. It's somebody who there have been reports that he's talked about a surveillance state. These are some interesting figures that you may not want to hand them the keys to the kingdom.
Well, it looks to me like they're calling in someone to do the homework for them, because what they're anticipating is if we can get a third mind or a fourth mind or whatever level of mind this is in AI running perpetually Bitcoin experiments, so to speak, a perpetual set of servers that are endlessly working the data that can clearly expand way past human capacity just to endure, that maybe we'll get there faster. Okay, that's a very intriguing thought. Of course, presuming that the data that's entered into the premise is accurate, because modeling is also dangerous. It was modeling that got us all buffaloed on COVID. Yeah. So, okay, but now here's the other piece of it. Look, none of this AI happens without electricity.
Yeah.
None of the current grid scenarios you can construct right now will give Oracle or Google or Apple or Amazon or X or anyone. No one can get the AI development that they want without more energy. And our grid cannot get them there.
Yeah.
These folks are all cozying up to government because they need literally power. I don't mean political power. They need to be able to turn the switch on. Yeah. And that means they're going to have to create their own form of nuclear energy. And they're going to need new licenses to do that, and they're going to need federal authority for that to happen. And that's the story nobody's talking about, because that's why they're all getting cozy. They would have been just as cozy with Kamala Harris as with Donald Trump because they need federal help. But makes us turn one more point here, and this is critical. In all of this, we would be remiss if we don't give the ultimate answer. The reason we have the executive orders that we have is because we don't have a Congress that's doing its job.
Yes.
And the reason Congress is not doing its job is because conservatives do not have a sufficient enough majority to be able to execute the role of Congress. Everything is brokered right now at the top with the leaders of the Senate. Congress is the problem. We're going to have to talk about that because 2026 is the next chance to try to solve it.